Hello, Ken Spriggs here, continuing work on my 2001 Discovery, working on the pod bay interior. Came up some really good ways to be able to not only extend one of the pods coming out of the pod bay, but also to move it from the center to the left side, and also to remove the pod itself from the platform. While at the same time lighting the pod and having lights in the headlights. So stay tuned for that, and I'll show you how I worked all that out. All right, so I'm working on the pod bay platforms and the pod that's going to extend out of the ship. So I started working with some square rod in order to put it on the bottom and enlarge these little areas so they can be extended and be a little sturdier than what the kit comes with. And it just started to pry loose this piece underneath it, so I went ahead and pulled it off so it's easier to work with. Nothing was damaged, I can just put it back on. And likewise, the lab wall to the left, I pulled apart as well, and that's still intact, so I just put those aside. I really should have worked on these first because getting under here is a little more complex than I thought, so I wanted to get into this area. So the way that the kit works, what it comes with is these little resin pieces, and they're not the sturdiest. They're kind of a cool design. It's a cool way to do it, but it's not really going to be that sturdy. So what would generally happen is that piece would go into here. And I enlarged these notches, that's why they're a little bit grooved up. But it would simply come into here, it would fit on there, and it would slide out. But you can see already it's starting to fall up, actually, because that's up. But there's nothing to stop it from kicking out at the bottom. Plus it's not the sturdiest, and I could just see those snapping off really easily. So I was looking for some ideas on how to get something stronger. And the first thing I came up with is some square rod. And I have this here. A lot of the ones I use are from K&S. I get it at my local hobby shop. This is the smallest that I could find. Now, I don't know if there's anything smaller, but it's pretty tiny. This is 1/16 of an inch. And it's brass square tubing. So that's this part right here. You can see it's a square tube, so it has an opening. So my initial idea was to enlarge these so that square would fit into there. And it almost fit into the bottom of these pod things, just a little small. But I found that if I grooved it out, I could make it fit better. But I decided on another way, and I kept working on several ideas before I finally got it down to where I need it to be. Because I want this pod to be lit. I want the headlights in front of it to light up. But I also want it to be removable because, as I said, this is a commission build, and the client wants it to be in the center pod, the center window. But as I told him, if it's in the center, you're really not going to see into the ship very well, because the center pod bay door is the easiest view for everything. If you put it in the left side of the ship, if you turn it over, like I did on mine, if it's on the left side and you extend it out, you can still see in, and you can see in through the front. So I decided to on an idea that it'll get best of both worlds, so that both the left side and the center will extend. The pod will be removable. It can be switched from the center to the left side and still light up. And so I mulled over this quite a bit and came up with some pretty clever ways of doing it, if I do say so myself. The pod on the right side is going to be stationary. It's not going to move, and it's going to be just glued in there because there's really not much to see over there, and there's no reason for that to extend and pull out. One of the issues that I run into, and you always run into, is that eventually, as you see, these things come together. These 2 points meet. And so unless you somehow stagger them above each other or below, which is hard to do, they're going to hit into each other. So this kit was encouraging, though, because using the connectors that they created, you literally could have them all 3 pull out the way they did it. But as I said, they'd be rather flimsy, and I think they would pull out but still be just a little shorter when extended than what I want them to be. So I think this idea is going to work a whole lot better, and it's going to be able to accomplish everything that I want to do. So I'm still going to use the square rod, and the square rod is generally going to be glued into place. And then I have this smaller rod, which is, I go dig all these up to figure out what I had, because these were already in stock. This is 3/64 of an inch. I'm sorry, hold on. Let me back up a second. That's not the right one. The small rod is 1/32 of an inch. That got ripped off at the top, so I had to scan the barcode and put it in, and it brought it up and told me what it was. So it's from the same company as the square rod, and it is a brass, just solid rod. So it's 1/32, and that's this one right here, and it's pretty sturdy. It's pretty thin. And then I'm also using, which I picked up the first time, sorry, this also very thin brass tubing, which is 3/64 of an inch, and it's a hollow tube. I have that right down here. Okay, so these are my 3 pieces. So this rod slides very nicely into this tubing, and likewise this rod also fits nicely into this square tubing. So let me show you here. So here's a piece of the rod that I first tested out and started with. You can see it slides in and out of the square tubing nicely, and it's in there pretty good. And then on the end there is a small piece of the brass tubing, the round tubing, that I cut off and I glued onto the end, and it's a stop. So picture this inside of the kit, and this is the back, and this is the part that actually pulls out and extends. So this square rod will be glued in place. It won't be this size. This was just the first test piece. And then I can push this in order to push in the pod platform, and then I can pull it out and it will extend, but it will stop when it hits that piece of rod, because this rod, you see that right there, little 2 pieces that match up with these, will not fit through this square tube. So what I can do is on the bottom of this again is a completed piece. This would be in here, and actually the square would extend out just a little bit, sort of like it is there. And like I said, don't pay any attention to the size of it. It's not permanent as to what it's going to be. So what will happen is the brass rod will be solid, and it will be cut off pretty close to where this is going to be, so that rod can extend all the way out until it hits this wall. And this will be glued into the pod, and it'll extend, not the pod platform. It will be going through those openings, and then I drilled some holes and into those little grooved parts right there. Okay, so I know this is a bit complex. It'll all come together whenever I start putting the pieces together. But this is going to accomplish several things. It's going to make this sturdier. It's going to make the center and the left side, if this were flipped over, extendable, and then be able to be pushed back in again. And in addition, it's going to accommodate lighting the pod using a tiny little SMD, which I have right here. All right, so to light the pod, all I really need to do is light the 4 front headlights, and this is hollow. So to do that, I'm using fiber optic, and so there will be 4 strands that are going to come through for the headlights, and they're going to come out through the bottom. And I figured out that in order to put them all into one styrene tube, that the right size would be 1/8 of an inch tube. This is from Evergreen, number 224, and it's a plastic styrene tube. So here's a piece that I'm just testing, and all 4 fiber optics will fit snugly in there. So once I get the fiber optics through it, I get the whole thing painted, ready to go, fiber optics coming out of the bottom, I can then stick them through this tube, and then this has a bottom that fits snugly into it. If I can focus on that right there. Wow, come on. Okay. And let me get closer here, I'm sorry. There we go. And I can drill that hole out so it is the same size as the styrene tube. So once I get everything gathered into the tube, I will cut it flush. So all you have are fiber optics. They're all flush. They'll be glued in with 5-minute epoxy. So imagine this is how it will look, and you'll have just a little bit of tube sticking out of the bottom. And it'll be flush, and you'll have just bare fiber optics. So no electronics in the pod at all. Then I took the pod platform, here's how it looks normally, and I drilled out a hole in the center that would accommodate this tube. And then likewise, I took the photo etch and I drilled out some holes. Once I got it the way it was supposed to be, I glued it in place, so it's on there now permanently. Let's see if I can get that in there. Okay, there we go. So you can see that tube fits just snugly in there. And it comes out the bottom. And on the bottom, there's going to be the SMD facing up, glued in with some 5-minute epoxy. So it's going to light the fiber optics. And it will then light, obviously, the headlights, which will shine out through the front of the pod. But the two won't be connected. So since this is connected and glued permanently into the pod and just sticking down, I can just plug it in, I can pull it off, and I can move it to the left pod or put it in the center pod platform. That way it's movable, but it lights. So then all I have to do is have a light in both the center and the left pod platform. So I'll have to do 2 of these. And then what's going to happen is, I have this mostly trimmed down. I might have to do some more. This is going to be glued into place, as I said, with some 5-minute epoxy, and it's going to be facing up or into that hole so it can light. and it's a white SMD. I believe it's I think it's either a pica or a nano. I'm not quite sure, but it's not the Z LED, and it's certainly not the chip. And then these brass rods are going to be coming through, and on this end, in that little groove right there, sorry, let me get a pointer. Oh, too big, sorry. Oh my. All right, so in these little grooves right here, I'm going to have these little two pieces, and I've already kind of fiddled with it a little bit. What I can do is, once I get this light glued in place and it's solid, and the wires are short enough that I can work with them and have them hidden underneath here, I'm then going to wrap this thin magnet wire, stick it through, loop it through one of these, and then bring that tube through right here, this solid rod through here, and stick it onto the end of this. It'll fit on there snugly, which will then glue that permanently into this little socket right here. And obviously one's positive, one's negative. So these are metal, these are brass, they are electrically conductive. So is the square tubing electrically conductive. So this solid piece that's going to be glued into the floor underneath, I'm going to solder or connect in some way wires on the bottom of the floor underneath. That will go to the power supply like everything else. And since this metal rod is making contact with this and sliding through it, it's going to make an electrical contact, make a circuit. So one of these will be the positive, one of these will be the negative, but there'll be no extra wiring that you're going to see. And this will simply slide in and out of these square rods while making contact the whole time. Light up the light, which lights through this hole, which lights up the fiber optics in this tube that are plugged into the pod. And as like I said, I'll have one in each of these platforms. Therefore, either one of these can be lit up, and I can take the pod and I can switch it. And I'm going to work out a similar type of a thing, because obviously if you pull the pod out of one, it's going to still have a light lit inside of it. I'm going to take another little small piece and put like a flat top on it and make it like a plug. Paint it black. This is all going to be black before I put any of this together. So if you take the pod out of the center, you can pop that little plug in there so you're not going to see the light. Or even, I even thought maybe like just a little black circle sticker, something simple that just obscures that light when you don't want it to be seen, or do it in the other pod as well. So that it can be switched, but it's not the kind of thing you're going to be doing all the time. You're going to display it with a pod in one orientation, or you're going to do it in another, and that sort of thing. So, all right. So again, I know it's a lot of complex ideas, but basically it's pretty straightforward. There's going to be brass inside the floor that's going to be wired in with power. That's going to then create a circuit with these tubes that are going to come out to here where the light is. And the pod's going to have a little tube with some fiber optic that you can click on, and it's going to light up. And then there won't be any wires to get hung up, because I was worried about that when I extend it and put it back in, that kind of thing. Because all you're doing is sliding the one brass conductible rod into another brass conductible tubing, and the wiring is going to be separate. It's not going to be attached to this piece that slides in and out. So there's no chance of it getting hung up or broken or snapped off or anything like that. So this will be solidly glued in. The connection inside will be solid, and the connections underneath here will be solid, that these also are not going to be moving and affecting the wires or anything. So, okay, so I got this one ready to go. I just need to go ahead and I'm going to have to get the light glued in first, so I have an idea of what I'm working with right there. Then I want to get it painted. I may paint it first and do that, we'll see. But this has to be painted first. That has to be painted just flat black. There is a decal that goes on, but that can be done at the end. That's not a big deal. Then once I get the light wired in, I can go ahead and get these wired into these little tubes, and then I can take these two rods, get them put into here and glued onto those. So in the end, I will have a completed pod with a light on it and the rods ready to go into these tubes. That way, once I'm ready to put them into the kit through the square rods, I can put them through and then glue on another little piece on the inside, because I also have a little bit of leeway to get to act as a stop, because once I put that on, obviously I can't put it through the tube. And then that way, that will be ready to go. Because once I attach, this has to be all done and painted and wired and ready to light up before I'm ready to permanently attach it onto the floor through this rod here. And likewise, I'll have the two square rods glued into the floor, and all of this painted, the rods painted as well. Even though there's probably going to be a little bit of paint coming off of those a bit as you pull it in and out, but unfortunately that can't be helped if you're just going to be extending it. But it's not like, again, the kind of thing you're moving in and out all the time. It's just going to be done infrequently. Because once I do that, this is going to be permanently onto here and it will not come off. So obviously I have to do each one of those separately and have it all ready to go before I'm ready to glue it in and have the wiring all set up. So, okay, so let me go ahead and start by getting this one completed so I can then go on to those steps. All right, so I want to interject here for a second with a correction on the terms that I'm using for these different parts. Mainly because I use iMovie to edit my videos and I really don't know how to insert the words over it, showing that I'm using the wrong words to describe these things. So this is a brass tubing. It's got a hole in the middle. It's a tube, not a rod. This is a rod, no hole. And this is also a tube. It's got a hole. It's a tube. So throughout these videos, which I've already filmed, you're going to hear me say rod, tube, rod, interject them, and it's not right. Just please ignore that. Forgive me. Understand what I mean, that I'm describing this piece versus this piece and not using them correctly. Likewise, I keep calling this a pod and it's a platform and confusing the two. So again, just understand when I'm describing these different parts. If I accidentally call this a pod and I'm showing this, it's a platform. It's not a pod. This is a pod. This is a platform. So, all right, back to our regularly recorded program. All right, so I wired in the light, the tiny SMD in the bottom. I still have to paint that off. I want to paint that with a little bit of white and then paint the whole thing black. But I don't want to do anything with that until I get the metal rods put in place and the wires attached to them. Then I'll paint the whole thing. But the light's in there and it works just fine. Let me see if I can get the right polarity. Of course not. There you go. There you go. Nice and bright. Okay. It's very cool. I also got the pod painted, and this is a 3D printed pod from Shapeways. They have quite a few that are available. The other one, which I showed in an earlier video, that has an interior and extra things. Obviously, there's several complicated ones. This one is simply a hollow one, and it had the holes drilled out for the headlights, which I have fiber optics in. Sorry, get that there. Just so you can kind of see, I'm just holding it up to this lamp here. Okay. So I painted this flat black first of all with Tamiya, and then I let it dry, and I went over it with some white Tamiya fine surface primer, and then I went over it with some misting of just some flat white. So a lot of the dark parts still stayed in the little crevices, which I think is kind of cool. Makes it look kind of cool, like those grips at the bottom. All of that detail in the back, you can see has some nice dark in it, which is cool. A lot of the other little machinery. So okay, so I still have to apply a couple of things. I have to paint that black for the window opening, and then I have a decal for it. Excuse me. Actually, I have a decal set that I got with the green strawberry, which puts a lot of these things on it, like especially the back, which is cool. All that detail in the back is going to be easy to put on. Those other little things there, the black window, those two side collar pieces. Now in this case, this being all one piece is going to help me out instead of hurting me like it did before. So that door, I can just cut out that whole rectangle in all one piece and apply it all together on that door, and that's going to look pretty cool. And the collars as well, I should probably be able to, yeah, because they're a circle. So I can cut the middle out of it and just apply it on the outside. The only thing they don't have are those little teeny thruster holes in the rounded dome, which I can just put some paint in there pretty easily and get that painted. So, okay. All right, so what I'm doing now, before I do any other decaling or painting on the pod, which is pretty much done otherwise, I took the bottom piece, which fits in there nice and snug, and I drilled a hole through it so this tube would fit. So what I need to do is cut it off so it's the right thickness so that this would fit down into this hole when this thing is sitting down on it, which is easy enough to do. And then I can go ahead and start putting these fiber optics through the tube, and then I'll just cut them flush with the end of it. And at that point, just finish up with the wiring, and then the pod should be about done, and then I can start working on getting the rest of that attachment for the rods and the tubes to go into the actual pod base. So, okay. All right, so I finished the first platform, other than painting it, of course, and have the light in it. I have the wires attached to these brass rods. They're all glued in place. First I glued it in with some CA glue, and then I put 5-minute epoxy, so that's hardening to bring the wires all together. And this will be kind of smoothed over once it's done. The epoxy I put on, so it's kind of a smooth. That way when I paint the whole thing black, you're not going to see any wires or anything underneath. So just to kind of show you, so I just have this square tube just slid onto this, and I just tuck the wire in there. Here's the black wire. It's So when I touch it onto here, the light comes on. So no wires that have to come out of this piece at all. It's completely separate. And even the square tubing is separate. And this will be attached inside of the floor. Sorry, I'm trying to do this with one hand. Okay, so that's separate too. They're just making contact because they're metal. So I'm basically just taking advantage of the fact that both the brass rod and the brass square tube are electrically conductive. So when they make contact, if I have this glued into the floor and I have a wire soldered onto it and one on the other side, by the very fact that these two things are touching, they're going to have contact. So when you turn it on, it's going to light up. But for all intents and purposes, this piece is totally separate. No wires whatsoever coming from this into the ship. And there's the light inside, ready for the pod. Let that harden up. All right. So I also completed the pod, which is pretty tricky. Well, it's not totally completed. It needs to be touched up with some more paint and some decals on it. But it was rather tricky to get all of that, get those fiber optics where they needed to be. But I got that glued in place. You can even see the fiber optics there as I sanded it down on the end of that little nub. And if I take this up to the light, you can see the light coming down through those as well, and vice versa. So, okay. So this simply just plugs into the hole in the top of this. And then when that's on, these will light up. And this can be removed from the pod platform and put onto the other pod platform. So, okay. So let me get this finished up and painted and ready to go, and then I'll do a demonstration of the pod lighting up on top of it. All right, so I finished up the pod platform. I got it decaled on the front. I had to paint some white over that first because these decals are clear backed. They're not white backed, so the little spaces or the ridge around it had to be painted white first. Okay, so that's all painted, sealed up. I had to play with how to make the rod black because putting paint on it makes it too thick and it doesn't slide through these square rods very well. So I stripped it back down and I tried a few things, and I ended up using just a Sharpie, and I also have a silver one, and it goes on fairly light. It will eventually scrape off, but for the time being it makes it look darker because obviously it's sliding in and out of metal, and it would be easy to reapply as well on there. So, and I cut out 2 pieces of the square stock to go into the floor, and I trimmed off where these need to be to go back as far as they can go into the floor. I also completed the pod. I used a photo etch claws. Let me see if I can get a little bit closer on that there. All right, so we used the photo etch claws that came with it. They're fairly well detailed. They're kind of nice. Might have to touch them up just a little bit. You can see a little bit of the brass showing through there. I got the decal set on, which is really nice. It was a bit tricky, but it looks really good. You can see the back door there. That little section over to the left. Of course, the black parts on the earmuffs, with the exception of the little holes for the retro rockets. I just had to use a toothpick and dab some paint into those because it's so tiny. I used I had to do some painting on the outer rim of the windshield, and then put the decal in the middle because it only fit in the middle. And then I put a little dab of 5-minute epoxy over top of that, and I'm letting that dry so it'll give it a clear look. It looks like a window. there. So, okay. So, oh, and I also put a little bit of silver accents there and some of those rounded, whatever those are at the top. Okay, so the pod is all done. It's ready to go. It's just sitting on this. I just stuck it in this tube so I could handle it. All right, so what I'm going to do now is go ahead and get these glued into the center of the floor where they're going to go. I have changed my mind as far as how this is going to work, because there is a simpler way to go about it. So my original plan was to have 2 of these that light up like this and have a light in them, and to put them into the floor permanently. And I talked about having a little piece of brass tube that went over the end of this to prevent it from coming out of the tube, and then I would just stick it in permanently. So it would pull out, and then you'd pull the pod off and just move from pod to pod. So a couple of reasons I changed my mind. One, trying to pull the pod off of this while it's attached to the ship might pull too much on these and potentially loosen it up or break it. I was a bit concerned about that. And secondly, creating 2 of these when I only really need 1. So what I've decided to do is to not put the ends on these. So this is removable, and I'll make another pod platform for the other side, which is just like this but without any light. It'll just have the same rods, and so the pod will still be removable if you want to take it off and just remove it all together. But I'm going to make so that this can just be slid out of the center, for example, and slid over to the left side, and the left side can be put into the middle, because these will be permanent. These will be permanently glued and solid into the floor. So all I have to really do is take this and just slide it in. It's pretty easy. It's what I ended up doing with mine from my first build. The entire pod platform on the left side, which is the only one that extends, comes out entirely. But instead of doing this process with the brass rod being conductive, I have a wire coming out and it goes into a connector, and I have to unconnect it, and I can remove it so I can take it out of the ship. So this is going to be far easier because all you have is this. Easy enough to get it lined up with those 2 square rods, slide it in. As soon as it makes contact with the metal, it will create a circuit, it'll light up the light, and then you can remove this and plug the pod into it, and then it's a lot easier to do it that way. And also less issues with plugging it in and out of here and hurting the paint. Putting that clear coat on seemed to protect it pretty well. I've put the pod on and off a couple of times, and it hasn't taken any of the paint off of this, so that's good. That should keep it pretty sturdy. Not that you're going to be taking it on and off very often anyway, but it still is possible. So, okay, so I want to go ahead and get the center one ready to go and completed, and kind of show how that's all going to work. All right, so I have the 2 aluminum tubes glued into the bottom. I glued them in first with some CA glue and let them set up. And then I went over them with some 5-minute epoxy and also secured in the wires there with some 5-minute epoxy. You can see I soldered the 2 wires onto the brass square rod. So it's making a connection. And I'll do the same with the one over on this side, so that both of them will be wired in. Then I'll just connect them together right down here once they're in there. I just left a lot on there to keep it to give it some room to work with for now. So okay, so now all I have to do is put the pod into there. I'm just going to show you with that one hand how it would work generally. Nope, I must not have it turned on. Sorry. I wired it in and I wanted to show how it lights up. All right, so there we go. See, as soon as it makes a circuit, the The lights come on and it lights it up. So let me get and put that inside and I will show you how that's going to look. All right, and there it is, extended a little bit. And obviously it goes all the way back until it meets up. It actually goes over top of those brass ones right there. Okay, but it can extend outside of the ship and light up. And the pod is still removable from the platform. And the platform can be taken out, as you just saw, and put into the other side. So that's going to be how it can be switched from the center to the side. Or really, if he wants to take the pod off entirely, just throw a black sticker over that lighted hole there so you don't see the light. And then just have two empty pods. And the one over in this side is going to be permanent inside and have a pod on it. So, okay. I still have to paint those rods there, obviously, in order to probably just black like I did the other ones. So I did try to do some research originally on my original build, and it looked like they were black. It was hard to see very carefully because you don't see it that closely whenever the pod's extending out, but it does look like they're a darker color. So all right, so that technique worked out really well. Really happy with it. It's really gonna give a lot of options for this, plus have a nice lighted pod. So all right, fantastic. Pod extended out from the ship, comes out nicely, as you can see, and it can actually pull out a little bit more too. That's also one of the benefits of having those rods loose, because if they had an end on it, it would only come out so far. Not to mention the fact that they wouldn't be as sturdy on the in those rods, because they wouldn't have as much room. I would have had to cut those rods off real close to that front edge, and it wouldn't have been as sturdy. So this way, a lot more support inside. This isn't going anywhere. It's nice and sturdy, and it can come out all the way actually, but it can extend a lot more because I was limited by as far back as that could go. So that'll work just fine, and then be able to have that pod light up. Okay. All right, so that's going to wrap up the video for this week. It's a lot more progress, obviously, on the Discovery. Really happy with how that's all coming out. So I'll continue working on that and finish up the other pod platforms, and then I'll be able to start getting the floor completed with the decal. I still have to work on the workbench in the middle of the pod bay, which I'm going to light up as well. And I just got some lights in from Evan Designs, so I'll be working on the remainder of the lighting for the pod bay, including the ceiling lights and things like that. So, and lighting up the maintenance corridor that I showed you last time. So stay tuned, lots of great stuff coming. Also stay tuned, I began work on my very large 2-foot Land of the Giant Spindrift 3D printed that I showed in a previous video. Finally got in the odorless CA glue that I need, because I can't use the regular stuff. It's too harsh on my sinuses and my eyes. So got some of that in, and I started putting that together. So stay tuned. I'll be doing a concurrent build of that and doing a video soon for that as well. So, all right. Thanks to all my new subscribers. Lots of really cool stuff coming up. So just keep watching.